I have the kind of terrifying honor of being the last speaker after all the great talks that we've had over the past 2 days. So pretty much everything's been said, so I apologize in advance that I'm going to be like, so if you remember what Pat said, and you remember what Andy said, and you remember what everyone else said, there's going to be a lot of that. So I'm going to be talking about third parties. I've spoken to a bunch of you at the conference already, and I'm aware it's a problem as much for you guys as it is for me. So we're going to look at what we can do. But before we kick things off, as I was introduced, I'm Ryan Townsend. You can find me on Twitter. I've been involved in web development, front-end, back-end stuff, managing teams, building companies, for the best part of 15 years now. And before we get into the actual talk itself, something happened last night. Estelle managed to catch me at a point where I'd had enough wine to be a bit over self-confident. And before this photo comes out on Twitter, I thought I'd just own it. So this is what happened last night. This is one of the rare occasions where I'm not wearing a baseball cap. It explains a lot behind why Estelle was so interested to know whether I had hair under my hat, because she was planning this all along, clearly. So when I'm not getting my head painted, I'm CTO for a company called Chaperones. What we do is we build an enterprise-scale e-commerce platform, so kind of like Shopify, but for much larger companies. And one of our largest clients is a company called Matalan. I presume a lot of people here won't have heard of them because they're kind of exclusively British. But they do over $1 billion in revenue. They've got over 220 physical stores, so they're a pretty big company. So web performance is a really critical thing for them, and that's why I'm here today, really. So I'm going to kick things off with just discussing what are third parties, just in case anyone isn't aware. We're going to move on to why they're a problem, and then why should we even be using them if it's such a big issue? Is there actual value in them? And then finally, the kind of crux of the talk is what can we do to mitigate their impact? So just to kick things off, third parties. To me, what they mean is any infrastructure or any service that you don't actually directly manage. It's something not on your origin that someone else is running for you and is interacting with your visitors, your customers, without you controlling it directly. So you might have, say, a CDN in front of your website. I would class that as kind of part of your infrastructure. It's something on your domain. Yes, it's a third party running that service for you, but I wouldn't really, you're in kind of control of what gets shipped through that CDN. It's more about other scripts. So why is this a problem? When I was kind of putting together this talk, I looked back through a bunch of other talks that people have given on similar topics, because I didn't want to just tread on everyone's toes and just repeat the past. And I came across one that was in Velocity conference back in 2011, so we're talking 8 years ago now. And it was by a couple of people at Google called Don't Let Third Parties Slow You Down. So they'd done some analysis on the average website that they see, and they found that a website was comprised of 7 different domains, there was 44 resources, and the whole total website was 320 kilobytes of data. And they said the web is slow. Now, thankfully, because Google are such a massive, influential company, the web lived happily ever after. Except it didn't. These are all the things that we have today on our sites. We were piling all of this stuff on. We're getting more and more day in, day out. Just a quick show of hands. If you take a look at this, how many of you reckon that on your site or your client's websites you'll see 3 or more of these? Yeah, almost everyone. 4 or more? 5 or more? There's still a lot of hands. So yeah, imagine all the problems we're going to talk about today are going to be multiplied up by that. So I was at Performance Now in Amsterdam, and Steve Souders presented this chart. It's an analysis of the HTTP archive, and he's looked at the growth of the number of scripts on websites over time. So back in 2011, he found that we had 4 of the first-party scripts and then 5 third-party. So it was kind of an even split. But where the majority of the growth has happened over the past 8 years has been in these third-party scripts. If we narrow that down to just e-commerce, the industry that I spend most of my time in, Yotta produced a similar report. It only goes back to 2015, but they saw it increase to 85 in just a matter of a couple of years. So it's an immense amount of third parties that are going on. And the trouble is that all these third parties come in and they just don't ask, like, oh, can I bring someone else with me? No, 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 no. Everyone just kind of piles in. So there's a tool called Request Map. And what this does is you plumb in a website, and it'll run some analysis on the site. It'll effectively run a web page test behind the scenes, and then it spits out this beautiful, albeit overly contrasted, diagram showing the website and everything connected. I don't think you can actually see all the lines, but imagine there's loads of lines between all these little bubbles. So the little light blue circle kind of near the bottom, that's the HTML payload coming down. This is actually the Guardian. And then you've got all these third parties that are kind of in a ring around there. And then all the requests that come off there, so you get fourth parties, fifth parties, sixth parties, and so on. Everyone likes to bring more and more stuff with them. But it's not even just the volume that we're including. I was sat in on a meeting where we were looking at selecting a particular vendor for a third-party vendor for a use case that one of my clients had. And they wanted me to help out with, making sure that it's going to be performant, checking that the implementation is going to be good. And so I asked them, I was like, what's going to be the impact of putting your script on my client's website? And they said, oh, don't worry, there's zero overhead, none at all. You just drop our synchronous script in. It's not as if we heard anything bad about those, right? You just drop that in, and yeah, our typical response time, we're using a CDN. So, it's 200 milliseconds. I mean, that's pretty bad for a CDN. So I was like, well, which is it? Is it 200 milliseconds or is it none? You can't have it both ways. And that's just the response time as well, right? The amount of JavaScript, again, this is Steve Sauder's analysis, the amount of JavaScript that we're pulling down, the actual payloads that we have to download once we've even hit that initial response time are getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And it's not even just the network. Once we've actually got the JavaScript, we get this continual JavaScript execution thereafter. So Addy talked about long tasks that taking over 50 milliseconds. I don't know whether you can see the kind of pink bars there of the CPU usage from web page test. This is just a site that I was running through with the Moto G4, so the average phone. And they had most of the 1 second blocks were covered by JavaScript. So it was just continually blocking that CPU. That's just on an average phone. It's not the worst case scenario, it's just an average case. You can have the best 4G connection in the world, but if it ends up blocking the CPU like this, it's going to be chaos. A guy called Patrick Hulse from the Lighthouse team has just produced a very enviable report I was hoping to produce myself about the CPU usage of third parties. And he actually found that the majority of the chunk of the web today, in terms of the CPU, is third parties. It's not even the stuff that we as developers control. And the actual average execution time, which doesn't actually sound like much, is 225 milliseconds per third party. But when you've got 85 of them, that kind of adds up to a lot. And a lot of this is going to be on the main thread. You're going to get some of it being able to go out to web workers or script streaming and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of this is going to be sat on the main thread. But it doesn't even stop there. It's not just our visitors who get affected by third parties, it's our businesses and our companies. You guys work on websites every day. Your development machine, when you load up all these third parties, it's not going to be remotely configured anything like production. Everyone thinks that that's where we want to be, but in reality, I don't think I've seen one company where a development machine looks anything like production. You're pulling in all these third parties, and it'll be tag managers that may be missing, so you've got half of them not even there. Or it may be that you're using staging configurations or development configurations that don't match production. Obviously, when that goes into testing, QA is going to be very difficult because, again, it doesn't match reality. Addy talked about restricting builds with Webpack, avoiding these big bundles. And you can't do that with third parties. If you can set your performance budget and kind of set up that automation, but it's only going to test your first-party content. It might be able to pull down the scripts from a third party as they are right there and then, but what's to say that the third party doesn't tomorrow just double the JavaScript, and then suddenly you're way out on all of your budgets. And the final thing here is just that you're handing over governance of your business to a third party. Now, there might be some way you can control the rollout. So you can say, okay, yes, now I'm going to upgrade to the latest version. But the majority of scripts that we put on our sites, the majority of content that we put on our sites from third parties, it's just a case of, well, here you go. You've now got the control. At any point they could roll something out and it'll break the site. So you've got to be mindful that you are literally handing over the reins to your site at that point. So if we have all this really negative stuff, why use third parties at all? You might have seen a lot of the speakers showing off their mugs. There's a bigger photo there if you want to have a closer look. This guy's got way better eyebrows and beard than I do. But yeah, so the interesting part of this mug is on the back. Estelle's written on the back of my mug, a fan of parties but not third parties. Now, I'm not actually that against third parties as such. If you have a party and you're there on your own, it's not a lot of fun. So there are valid reasons for bringing in these third parties. You can't build everything yourself. It's a simple fact. This is why we rely on other businesses to help us. And whether you're big or small, you shouldn't be doing everything. You don't have the time, you don't have the resource, the expertise to do everything. Even if you do have all of that, you've got to question, should you be building all of this stuff, right? It could be that there's infrastructures to maintain, you've got to keep your security, on top of that. You've got to keep on top of your performance. I'd hope that would be at least the first thing that we look at. And then it's not the focus of your business necessarily. I've heard of companies looking at building their own content delivery networks because they don't want to pay Cloudflare or Fastly a bit of money. And it's like, but are you going to actually build out a department to then take that product forwards? You could clone the product today, and you might get somewhere close to it, but then they're going to continue innovating, and you're going to miss out on all of that innovation. The world's going to move on without you unless you continually invest in this product. And you're really good at selling shoes. Why are you now building a content delivery network? You could also be hacking around technical limitations. So this could be your content management system or your ecom platform. Not if you're using Shift, of course. But yeah, there's limitations with what you can do with any software. So it could just be that you physically cannot implement it yourself. So you've got to put a tag, into your site. Maybe you're running a static site. So you've got something like Netlify there, or you're using Gatsby. And you're spitting out a static site, and you need a bit of interactivity on top. So you want this, third parties to pull in some kind of live data. And then the final one is organizational limitations. So this could be that you have legal restrictions around. You need to put something on there for auditing customers as they browse around. A lot of people do this with credit card payment providers, where they'll track the users for like fraud and things like that. Or it could be just simply that you can't roll things out quick enough. If you've got a culture of moving very, very slowly, and you need to get something delivered so that you can get the value out of it, ultimately you can't. You might have all the resource on the planet to do it and know exactly how you want to build it, but you're never going to get out the door. So there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to use a third party. So given that we're kind of somewhat stuck with them, what can we do? The first thing that we need to start with is just identifying our third parties. And there's some fantastic other talks that I'll show you a slide in a second on how to do this. So I'm going to briefly cover it for anyone who's not seen them before. If we go back to if we go back to that request map, you can look through this and look for these outer things that are including fourth and fifth and sixth parties, and they're good candidates. I think the larger the circle is, the larger the file. So, you've got these bigger scripts that are getting pulled in. Maybe select those. You can run a web page test and look for things that are executing a load of JavaScript after it's loaded, or you're downloading some really big files. If you hop into Chrome, if you go into the dev tools, there's actually under the performance panel, you can run an audit. I think this video is a bit slower than I'm talking. So, and then if you hit the little reload and start profiling button, it'll run a profile against your site. And then once it's all loaded, you can go into the little summary tab at the bottom and click bottom up. And then group by domain or group by product, and you can see the different companies that you've got in there. So it's a good way to just identify. This doesn't really, it can show you a basic view of what's using a load of CPU or what's using a bit of network. Ideally, you want to get this stuff out of RUM. So these are the talks that I mentioned. Three of the people that are here today. So we've got Andy, Tim, and Katie. So I really recommend checking these talks out. They're all available online. And I just advise looking into that stuff. So now I'm going to get really technical, so I apologize if anyone's a bit sleepy and you've had two full days of information barraging into your brain. Hopefully it's not that like Homer Simpson thing of like whenever someone teaches me something new, it pushes something out the other side. So the first thing, I'm going to cover 6 points, and the first one we're going to look at is just when and where do you need this third party. And there's loads of times when I see scripts that get thrown onto a site and they're on every single page just because that's an easy way to just chuck it into the HTML, your layout file or whatever it may be. And they're literally across the entire website, but they're only used on one page or one section. So that's worthwhile considering. It may also be like certain device types. So you may only want to load things for mobile or for tablet or whatever it may be. And how critical are they as well? It's not just a case of do we want it for certain device types or certain pages? It could be, we think, okay, well, if someone's on a really slow connection, they're on 2G or something, the last thing we want to do, they're going to have a pretty painful experience. We don't want to make it more painful. We'll probably make more money if we give them a faster experience and allow them to actually use the website rather than trying to sell them even more stuff. So just be mindful of the kind of progressive enhancement side of things. This term was coined years and years and years ago, like when I was only just starting in web development. And it's something that we've kind of focused around for first-party JavaScript, thinking, hey, if we don't have JavaScript running or there's some sort of error, then the site will still function without it. But usually we only look at that from a first-party point of view, and we should consider it for third parties as well. Like, do we need to pull it in for everyone? And what happens if it does go wrong? My third tip is, do we need all of it? There's a lot of times when you're pulling down this immense amount of data. We've seen the growth in the third-party scripts. I was going through the code coverage tab on one of my clients' websites, and this is just the third parties. This is what Adi was going through earlier. You can see there's an immense amount that's just being sent down the wire but not even used. I totaled this up, and there was 890 kilobytes of mainly JavaScript, there's a little bit of CSS in there, that's being downloaded but never executed. So it's a pretty tricky thing because obviously you don't control these scripts generally, but there's some things that you might have control over. Well, first of all, just checking that they've enabled gzip or Brotli. I don't know how to say that. Check that if you're loading fonts, things like Google Fonts allow you to subset over a certain set of characters, or only pull in the fonts that the kind of glyphs that you need. If you've got loads of things capturing data, 10 different analytics platforms, rather than passing all of that data around, you can use a tool to centralize it and then push into those in the background. So things like Segment are really useful for that. And then Jenna mentioned just like not loading libraries when you don't really need them. A lot of times I see like 15 different versions of jQuery downloaded by every single third party. They're all trying to bring jQuery in. So what you can often do there is either disable it and just host it yourself, or just use like feature detection to detect whether it's already on the page, and then they only load it if it's not there already. Another kind of anecdotal thing is checking for your image transformation. So I believe there's some people from Cloudinary here, and optimizing the images on your site is going to be a really, really big thing. But what we found with this particular example, this is a personalization tool. So what it does is it follows you around as you browse around a site, and then recommends products based on what it feels you have like affinities with. So it, for some reason, wants me to buy a suit. Maybe I don't think it'll go with a baseball cap. So it's a fairly simple bit of functionality, and then it produces this recommendations. Now, what it was doing as it was scraping the site is it was downloading these enormous images like that were on the big product pages. So it was looking at the really high resolution images and going, yeah, we'll take those. And then when they were presented back to the user, like these were only about 150 pixels wide. So we were putting like 2 megabyte images in these slots, and we didn't control it. So we assumed that, wrongly, that they were actually able to compress this stuff their side, but when we called them out on it, they were like, no, we can't do that. So what we had to do is provide an alternative URL for them to download as they scrape with a much smaller image. But just be mindful that the kind of data that we're shipping out to these third parties could be abused. Another anecdote that I see in terms of the giant payloads that we get downloaded is a lot of technical debt. So an example of this is in A/B testing. Some of my clients will be trialing new changes out and checking that they're actually going to have a positive impact on those business metrics. And then when the test passes, they're like, great, we need to get that implemented into the real site now. This is going to be what we move forward with. And then their development pipelines are kind of ground to a halt. This is the reason why we have things like tag managers. So effectively what they do is they just crank the test up to 100% because they don't want to lose the revenue and just leave it there. So like 3 months later, everyone's been executing all this JavaScript just to display the site as if it was going to be every single time. So if you can open up your pipeline and get that stuff out of there and into the real site quicker, it's not really a technical fix, but it's a really important thing to get as much out of A/B testing and into the real site as possible. And then inside those scripts, if you've got things like personalization platforms or A/B testing tools where there's a little bit of code that kind of executes based on how you've configured it, if you can get into that code and actually optimize it in that platform, it's usually something that's kind of hidden away from developers because it's a tool that e-commerce departments and things like that are tinkering with, UX teams like to use their A/B testing tool, and you're like, oh, I don't really want to get involved in your side of the business. But the trouble is that a lot of these tools are based on WYSIWYG editors, so if any of you are here from the Dreamweaver days, you'll know how bad the code is that comes out of the back of these things. So if you do have access to that code, and you can optimize it, both from the point of view of the size of the code that's being downloaded, and also from the point of view of the CPU power that it takes to execute, then you're going to be able to shrink that data down as well. My fourth tip, this has been covered so many times because it's such a big thing, is loading things asynchronously or deferred to the after page load. This is a really tricky one, particularly for things that interact with the DOM and make changes to your site. But the impact is immense from doing this. Again, from one of my clients, we switched a single script that was synchronous to asynchronous, and this was the effect on the start render times. So we dropped mobile and 3G down by 2 seconds, tablet down by a second, and I think desktop was something like 800 milliseconds or something. This had an immense impact on conversion, on bounce rate, and all the other business metrics, and ultimately led to a much greater amount of revenue. Now, the trouble is, when you do those things with tools, as I say, that are interacting with the DOM and making changes to the design, everyone brings up the flicker, the dreaded flicker, things are going to change as the website loads. Well, it's something to bear in mind. You don't want that to be too bad, and there's some things that I'll cover in a second that can minimize that. But you've got to bear in mind, one, how the web loads today. We load things progressively. People are used to things changing as they build up the page. So you've got to be mindful of how people are interacting with the web platform as it is today. But also, it's worthwhile looking into how those scripts are actually acting on the page. I've seen things like review tools that are pulling in independent third-party reviews of a given product. They're pulled in synchronously, but they're hidden behind a tab. So someone's never going to see that immediately on page load anyway. I've looked into a lot of my clients' A/B tests, and most of them, if not 99% of them, I would say, don't interact with things that are even above the fold. So a lot of the time, you can still have very accurate A/B tests without, having to block everything from loading just so that they can execute before the page renders for the first time. Now, it is still something that people worry about, and there's times when you need to prevent rejigging of the page. You don't want loads of reflows 10 seconds after the page is loaded. So what you really need here is like a curfew. You're going to cut off the time, and people are going to go home. So there's a really simple way to do this with fonts. You can use the new font display thing, a CSS attribute. And you can say, okay, I want to fall back. If the fonts don't arrive in a few seconds, I want to fall back to the system fonts, and then on the next page view, they're going to get the nice fonts. If only we had something like that for scripts as well. At the moment, you can't specify a timeout on a script tag. You just say, load it, and then hopefully it'll arrive at some point. And the trouble is that it falls back to, I believe it's the TCP defaults of the machine. So on Windows, it's 20 seconds, and then on Unix systems, it's 80 seconds. So, if you've got a blocking script and it's taking forever to respond, people can end up waiting 80 seconds. Now, no one's going to be left. Everyone will be gone. And the trouble is, from a point of view of analytics, if that's blocking before your analytics script, you're never even going to know, because you're not actually going to be tracking that bounce rate either. If you can't get to that analytics script because you're waiting 80 seconds for another script to download first, no one knows. So there is a little nasty trick that you can use to kind of fake these things. What you can do is kind of hide the body. So this is a demo of just a script that's loading. I'd say fast, but it's relatively 700 milliseconds isn't that quick. The next page is what happens when this goes really slow. So this is I've set this to timeout in 5 seconds. I think it takes a bit longer than that. Yep, so just over 5 seconds, and we saw nothing until that page loaded. Now, the ideal thing would be to say, okay, if it's going to take that long, show the page, and something's going to happen afterwards. So there is a little technique that you can do this. So the page gets shown after a certain timeout. This is set to 2 seconds. And then the script finally loads in afterwards. And you can optionally execute that script or not. And the way that I've done this, it's a really hacky thing, is to effectively display on the body. This is nasty. You need to check the accessibility of doing this before you do it. But if you're working with ads, this might be better than nothing. What you can do is set a timeout to show the body after a certain amount of seconds. So in this code, we've got it after 3 seconds. We load the script tag asynchronously, so it's not blocking everything else on the page. The parser can continue down into the body and continue doing everything it wants to. And then when that script arrives, we then show the body. If it arrives sooner than the timeout, great. We show the body as soon as it arrives. But if it doesn't, we wait until that timeout, and then we show it. So that way we're not blocking everything from happening just because of this one script. So in the ideal situation, take ads for the example. Most people who run ads, their business is dependent on those ads being shown to a customer. So for the majority of customers, you don't want your site to be that quick that they've read half the content, scrolled past all of the adverts, and then suddenly, they've never even seen them load. You want a situation where the ads arrive as the content does. Which is kind of counter to kind of user experience, but you need to get your revenue from somewhere, so I get it. So this is kind of a halfway house where you say, okay, we're going to try and get things to arrive at the same time, but if the ad platform's just really slow, we don't want to impact our customers that bad because they'll just never come back, and then we lose more ad revenue further down the line. So that's the really hacky way of doing it. There is a slightly better version. It's a lot less hacky, and it will actually block the script from continuing, but it's a little less unreliable. So what we can actually do is we can use Service Worker to install a timeout into our scripts. So this is loading a really slow page. Got a script there that takes 5 seconds to download. So you can see there in the DevTools, we've got a 5-second load on that script. So the first time we load the page, it takes forever. And then the second time, it's a lot quicker, because what we've done is after the page load, the service worker is installed, and then that's now got the timeout. So I believe this bit of code, because I was looking at, I was like, oh, service worker is amazing, there's so much power here. And I figured out, I was like, oh, maybe I can do like a timeout thing. I remember Googling this years ago, and I believe it might be Patrick's code from Fastly's at the back. So props to Patrick. Effectively, all we're doing is a really simple piece of code. We check for a given host name, and if it's not that, we just skip it. You know, we want all of our normal requests to go through fine. So you say, okay, I'm going to check any request for a given host name, and then I'm going to set up a promise that races that request against the timeout. If the timeout occurs, I'm just going to create a synthetic response, that's the bit at the top, that is a fake timeout, and then the request just continues in the background. So that's one way of not having such a hacky experience, but setting that cap on scripts from downloading. So the only downside to this is, one, you know, it's a case of you've still got that blocking script in if you don't switch to async, and two, it only works after the first page load. So, you know, if people are hitting your site for the first time and that you've got an outage with a third party, this isn't going to be there already. Number 5, the penultimate tip, is to self-host. Again, everyone's talked about this. Pat's covered a lot around why this is far better. You know, you don't have to set up another DNS lookup, another connection, SSL handshakes. You've got better HTTP2 prioritization because it's all on one connection. Better because, you know, it's kind of broken at the moment. You can control your own caching, so you can do fingerprinting and things like that to set your URL so they only expire when the actual contents have changed. And it does play nicer with content security policies. I don't see that great adoption of CSP because it's a nightmare putting everyone's host name and all these different files in. If you self-host stuff, obviously, you know, whitelisting your own domain is a lot easier. The only trouble is you've got to bear in mind how you do it, because if you're copying down live files, you might create a backdoor there. So just be careful around the security side of things there. And then the only downside to this is if you are manually copying these files down and self-hosting them, which is great for things like fonts, it's not so great for tools that change. So say you've got an A/B testing tool. You know, what are you going to do about the changes? You know, the whole point of these third parties is that you're like, hey, here's a URL, put that on your site, and I can change your site whenever I want, which is very dangerous, but, you know, we've accepted that. So there's a few ways that you can deal with this. Pat talked about proxying, so you can effectively push all of the requests through your CDN provider and proxy them back out in the background to the original origin. So that way, you're kind of controlling it and keeping that under one connection, but you're not actually cloning down the files. And then there's another technique that we've actually implemented with another third party, which is like a dual phase loading. So what we do is we pull down it's a script that modifies the page. So we want to make sure that there's minimal reflow as possible. We don't want to show stuff that then gets hidden and things like that or changed. So we pull down a script inline that we embed in the head of the page. And then we have an async script that then runs separately. And the benefits of this is that the first script is first party. We don't have to go off and make a blocking call out to this third party. And what it does is it will hide elements. It will create gaps in the DOM where it needs to. And then the async script, when it arrives, fills that content in. And it only affects the stuff that it's actually designed to affect. So that way you can get around, you know, that flicker and everything by having this kind of dual phase, and you don't have that single point of failure. Casper beds, or mattresses, I guess, did a similar thing to this. What they do is they pull down their Optimizely account, which is just an A/B testing tool, They pull down the JavaScript on a periodic basis, and they store that in an Amazon S3 bucket, push it up to Fastly, and say, hey, this is the new version. And then they render that into the page each time. So rather than hosting it on Optimizely servers, and they're hosting it from their own, but they're just cloning it on like a 5-minute basis. So things get updated all the time. And the benefit of that is that the users only have to download that bundle when it has actually changed. Because with Fastly, you can actually you can put that fingerprinting in place, and only the fingerprint will only change when the files actually change behind the scenes. So they saw immense benefits. They chopped 1.7 seconds off their start render time just by self-hosting a script that is exactly the same as loading it from a third party. So this is just a quick little diagram of how it all works. So you've got Optimizely on the right, and they schedule an update using Lambda to pull it into the Amazon S3 bucket, and then push that up to Fastly to say, hey, here's the new version, and then that's how it gets to customers. So I appreciate that was really fast. These slides will all be online, so don't worry. And then the final tip I have in terms of the kind of technical things is can we pre-connect and preload? You know, using resource hints. If we're going off and connecting to all these different origins, pulling in different files, obviously resource hints could be a great help for you there, but it's been spoken about a load already, so I'm not going to cover it again. So if we can't necessarily make these technical optimizations, bear in mind that you can choose your friends. Just because you don't want to like take someone's toys away and say, sorry, you can't have A/B testing anymore because it puts too much of an impact on the site, you can say, no, we'll switch to another provider, and then you can find someone who's a bit more performant. Because the trouble is, when third parties sell you their service, they promise this, really suave looking, really smart. But then it actually gets implemented, and it looks a lot more like this. This baby's appeared out of nowhere. This guy's lost a tooth. These are the guys that I want in my party. So if you're looking at evaluating your third parties, you might be having a bit of anxiety at this point, and like, Pat, I don't want you to be leaving with that. There's a great tool. There's a great tool called JS Manners. This is by Andrew Betts at Fastly. And basically, it allows you to rate third-party scripts. So you can go through a whole bunch of different questions, and it gives you scores. So if you're evaluating different providers, or even just evaluating what you have today, then you can put yourself at a bit of ease by going through this and saying, all right, it's not as bad as Ryan's been telling me. So hopefully, you get all the kind of A grades on this. But yeah, if you're looking for other third parties, you can ask them a bunch of questions, or look through their documentation, and then get a score out the back of it, so you can see whether you can improve. You can keep the tool there for the departments that need it, so you're not saying to marketing or sales that they can't do anything anymore, but you are just switching providers. And we talked about the kind of technical side of optimizing our experience, but I wanted to cover off protecting our site as well. If you can't switch to another provider, the very least we can try and do is protect ourselves from unannounced outages and things like that. So the first way you can do this, and one of my favorite things to do, because it's fairly straightforward and most people can implement this fairly easily, is to have some means of getting everybody out. So what you need is a kill switch that just says, right, this third party is dead. All the alarm bells are going off in New Relic and SpeedCurve and all these different tools that you use. We just need to turn this one off. And the way that we do this at Shift is we typically implement environment variables that just say toggle on or off. It's as simple as that. So most people with their setups can do that kind of thing. If you've got a tag manager, you can just do it within there. There's also this awesome new header. It's got a few bits of adoption, so it's not massively well supported, and there's a lot of experimental parts to it at the moment. But there's a bunch of performance attributes and values that you can put in here. So you can say block things like synchronous AJAX calls, block document.write. You don't want old image formats. You don't want someone putting bitmap files on your site. You don't want the problem that we had with the personalization tool where they were taking 2,000 pixel images and downscaling them to 100 pixels wide. You can limit images so that they have to be compressed at a certain ratio. So you say, okay, I'm going to give you a budget of so many bytes per pixel. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can configure there. This is mostly experimental, so it's something just to be mindful of for the future. But we don't just need to protect our site against the third parties. A lot of the tools allow our site to be ruined by our own companies. I couldn't do a third-party talk without talking about tag managers. And the worst thing about this is it's all our fault. We've allowed the situation to get this bad. So for those of you who aren't aware, tag managers allow other departments in the company to implement scripts onto your site. So they completely bypass everything that we do to test and make sure that everything's performant, and they just throw things in. And that all came about because we couldn't get things live quick enough. So really, we need to try and unblock our release runway and get things out a lot quicker. It's not a technical fix as such, it's more of a cultural thing. But if we can roll out changes really quick, putting a script on the site after doing a little bit of testing and just validate that that's, it's good to go, that's far better than having someone go into a separate tool and, do it behind the scenes. One thing again, like I mentioned technical debt in things like A/B testing tools. This builds up in tag managers as well. I've seen scripts that have been in tag managers for years on end. There are some benefits if you need to access certain events that are happening live. But the scripts that it's just like, oh, we just want to inject this one script tag in. And it's been in there for years. It's like, well, I get that you've had to do that to get around the limitations of getting stuff released in time. But it's been in there 2 years. We could have got that onto the main site, and then the pre-parser can see all of that. We should just be moving things slowly into the real site, and then you're going to get a better development experience as well. And ultimately, if you can get to server-side tag management rather than having it execute JavaScript, then that's going to be like the holy grail as well. So I was looking at how people implement these tag managers, and I found an interesting example. There's a company in the UK called Shoe, who sell shoes, and they actually had 2 tag managers. And usually we look at these things and go, well, you've got a bit of duplication here. We should probably remove one of these things, right? But they've done it for a very good reason. What they've done is they put one really near the top that is async, but it's stuff that needs executing as soon as humanly possible. So this is like analytics and stuff like that. And then they've got another one that gets triggered after page load, so this is deferred, that has everything else. So all the remarketing, we're tracking people around the web, all the kind of nasty part of the web that we pretend doesn't exist. That's all gets dumped in there. And effectively, we can say to the departments that need it, you can go and put stuff in that one. That one's easy, because it's not blocking that kind of critical phase of getting stuff on the screen. It's way after page load. So I'm very wary of time, but I'm very close to the end, I promise. One thing to bear in mind with all of these third parties is just to remember that you have leverage. There's a lot of companies that pay a lot of money. I've seen 7-figure contracts with third parties. If you've got contracts like that, remember that you do have leverage and you can work with these third parties to fix things. Because ultimately, you fix it for your site, and everybody wins who's using that tool. It's not just you, there's like a network effect. Going back to Patrick's study, he published it, and then Word Ads managed to optimize their scripts down from 2.5 seconds of execution down to 200 milliseconds just weeks after he'd released it. And the impact of this affected 32,000 websites. So this is outstanding. This is an immense impact on the whole web. So if we can all do the same across the top third parties, I think, if I remember rightly, the stat is that the top 100 third parties, so big companies, they account for 57% of the JavaScript execution. So there's an enormous amount to gain there by bullying those companies in, or being nice and working with them kindly, into fixing the performance issues with their scripts. So just to wrap up, you don't make friends by taking toys away from people. So try and understand how people are using third parties in your organization, rather than trying to take them away. You're going to have to work with what you have and optimize it. You will get burnt at some point. Some script's going to fall over. Even if you've got SLAs, they're going to be like, oh, we'll pay you, the percentage of your contract. It's like, oh, great, I get like 50 quid for you losing, thousands of pounds of my business. So you need to protect yourself from that. So the things like the timeouts and things like that, just considering how you're loading this stuff will help with that. And then ultimately, if we can work together with these third parties, we can benefit the whole web. So it's a really positive way to kind of end the conference, I think, is that, we've seen with that word ads example, the immense impact that we can have across the web. So thank you very much. It's been great.